Back to our study of the early Christians and comparing them to the scriptures as well as to ourselves and seeing what we can learn. Last week we got into what I always simply refer to as the instrument innovation part of it, and we had some good questions, some good feedback afterwards. I'll remind you, in your handouts, we're on roughly slide 39. But remember, I am using a slightly edited presentation, so it may not. As we begin this morning, I've asked Ed, one of the things about a classroom setting is you get to draw on the varied experiences and backgrounds of everyone there. So we heard from a couple of different backgrounds last week as far as their experience with music, etc. I asked Ed if he would to take a few minutes this morning. Of course, many of you know Ed came out studied himself out of Catholicism into the church, having been, fair to say, devout as a Catholic, and then coming into the church with the wide difference in the musical background. I asked him just to talk to us a few minutes about what that experience was like for him compared to going to the worship of the Catholic Church.
One thing about the Catholic Church, which is unique about the Catholic Church, is that I was going to a cathedral when I was growing up at different places there in the Catholic Church, and when you went in there, you had the organs with all the pipes and everything. Oh, and the music was so wonderful with the organs as they're doing it, and the singing. And I can't tell you how many days I left the Catholic Church after going to Mass, and I was floating. Like, I felt like I was floating, because after they get, I don't know what they put in that incense, but it just makes you high, you feel high after smoking, hearing and smelling the incense. But with the pomp and the ceremony and everything, but the music was just so wonderful. It was a big, beautiful organ. On top of that, my mom would sing solo for the Catholic Church, the Ave Maria. That was a big thing. And when she had the organ behind her and as she sang, there was a representative from Hollywood. This is in Michigan. He wanted to take her after Mass to Hollywood and make her a star with her singing. It was so beautiful. He said he'd never heard a voice so nice. And anyway, my dad said, wait a minute, I've got 8 kids, we're not going to Hollywood. He told him to go away, He didn't go. I'm glad they didn't go. But here's the thing about music. Feeling good about how good it sounds with the instruments and music. I didn't worship God. I was in there for entertainment, but it sounded so good, right? Well, when I was baptized, I was in a congregation of 65 members. And the song leader there was, you couldn't call him a song leader, but I'll tell you what, they were kind of singing over there at that little congregation where I just wanted to walk away, go away, and not come back because of the autumn. Anyway, it was bad. Went to Sunset School of Biblical Studies. The first Sunday there were 2,500 brothers and sisters all singing. When they were singing that a cappella music there, the Catholic Church couldn't touch it because all their organs and all the pomp and the ceremony. When I went in there, I'll tell you the way I felt hearing that many brothers and sisters singing all at one time in unison. I felt like I had died and gone to heaven. So singing is a beautiful thing that God has asked us to do.
So this is really kind of where we began last week. And mainly last week we looked at the I'm moving lens. I was blocking myself from the camera. It's an old habit. Going with that. Mainly last week we got through some of these looks at the history of various denominations when it comes to music. And the main thing I want to remind you of is just that for all, what is a good word to describe? Maybe if we use the term, some of the core denominations. So obviously here we are in 2023, and we've got hundreds upon hundreds of various groups that have come from one of those core denominations, really, whether it was Wesley's work, Calvin's work, etc. So you've got Methodist and the Baptist. You've got what are some of the others? Yeah. So, and over time, we've had a tremendous. We haven't experienced anything like that in the church, though, right? Even in this country, of course, what became known as the Churches of Christ had a split that I'm afraid now at this point we're forgetting our history over because there is a lot to learn from that history. But from the split that we had around the aftermath of the Civil War, we broke into three groups basically. The Churches of Christ, the Disciples of Christ, and the Christian Church. And for a long, long time, it's not true anymore, but for a long time, the only difference, real difference, between us and the Christian church was what? It was the music. That was a main part of what was behind that split. Is that was the time when some of these denominations that we've talked about were getting away from their own roots and their founders' teaching and bringing in the instrument. And naturally, as I always say, if it starts in the denominations, in 10 years it's in the church. That's just an observation. But I'm getting old, so I've had a lot of time to review, and I do try and be a student of history as well. Sometimes I get so frustrated with some congregations that I'll use the old joke on them when I first speak there that I'm surprised to see them coming in through the doors. Don't they know that's how the denominations enter the building? Sometimes we stay too far away from things that are biblical practices because of our awareness that, the denominations do it that way. But in our own history, we had that split. We got the Christian church. If you go to a Christian church today, there's really a wide range. It's sort of like I warned you about prejudging any group that has Baptist in its name. There's a wide range of what you might find going on in that building in any worship service. But the last time I was in a Christian church, I felt like I was in a Catholic church. They had changed that much. They had crosses everywhere. They had the clergy robes. And just kind of on and on and on. And I thought, and that was over in Pensacola, by the way. And I thought, it's come a long ways from that long-standing difference of just being, hey, we want the instrument. But that created that split. The Disciples of Christ, and I don't think I've ever been to a worship service with a group that termed itself that, but they're still there. The key thing I want you to understand about that, it's the main reason I bring this particular history up. Might have been a Freudian slip there, Tony, I don't know. Why did we divide three ways instead of just two? why didn't we just have us in the Christian church and the main difference be the use of that instrument?
Missionary.
That does come into it. But the main thing that brought about those type of deals was that the Christian church, their earliest leaders did not change their hermeneutic. In other words, they still interpreted the Bible by the logical rules of hermeneutics. So they had the same mindset that we in general apply to the scriptures, and our goal to find out God's true intention there. They had the same one, you know. It's just some of them really thought that we were missing out on this instrument thing, and so they wanted it. And that's another reason why they stayed so close to us for so long. I mean, decade after decade, you could go in one. 30 years ago, you could go in one. And on the average one, the only real difference you would notice is that they were using the instrument. And in fact, sometimes when I'm trying to teach about the Spirit of Christ and the spirit of humility in worship, I like to share an experience that happened to one of my friends who is a preacher, and he was one of my professors at one point, and he told us about, at that point, a very recent experience. So as a preacher and a professor, he traveled a good bit speaking different places. And so he was traveling on one of those trips. He was driving. It was the middle of the week, and he wanted to go to Bible class somewhere. The only place around was a Christian church. So he stopped at the Christian church and went into the Bible class. And of course, he got there a little early, so people are talking to him early. They found out, of course, his background, you know, that he was a preacher in the churches of Christ, everything. When they got up there to begin their service that night, they said, we have a brother who's here tonight, you know, preaches in the churches of Christ, so we won't be using the instrument tonight.
Okay. I've heard this.
So just out of, you know, a spirit of love and not wanting to give offense to that professor of mine, they didn't do it. I wondered how that would play the other way. I did wonder about that. But, you know, that they stayed so close to us for so long. And then about the time I like to say in American religious history that everything went hazy. In other words, we got further and further away from a concern for what does the Bible say about what we do in worship to what do people want us to do in worship. And that was across the board, not, you know, denominational world as well as in the church. And but the disciples of Christ from the very beginning, they wanted to argue for a new hermeneutic. They wanted to argue for a more liberal way of looking at the scriptures and taking those as scriptures. And of course, what did that do for them? They could justify anything they wanted to do, you know, because they weren't overly concerned with the straightforwardness of the scriptures on it. But rather, well, let's look at it this way, that way, and from over here to the east, and let's get down here and the southeast and look at it and just let's kind of determine that way versus, okay, this is what the scripture says, this is what we need to do. So from the very beginning, even though we all came from that same historical root in this country, from the very beginning of that division, and you have to understand, it's kind of like a divorce, guys. By the time the official split happens and we go the three ways, people had been practicing whatever their desire was, according to those three groups of thought, for a while were pretty set in it. It just becomes official. I think officially it was just shortly after 1900 that the official split was, but it was pretty much over a decade before that began to take place. So there's some good lessons there. Some good lessons about our approach to the holiness of the Scriptures in general, and about what can happen once you begin to bring in things with a rationale other than this is what God has commanded us to do. So with that in mind, I'm going to try to skip pretty far ahead of these quotes. There's Adam Clark. Still love all his discussions on it. I remember we talked about this quote from the Baptist historian. And I want you to understand something too. All my life, and until this day, when I research these things, I don't just research them in Church of Christ scholars at all. I always first start with the Scriptures themselves and determine for myself what I believe God is teaching there. And then I usually go to some of these past denominational scholars and some of these current ones as well before I ever turn to any Church of Christ scholars and look at what they say. And I do that, of course, to try and keep some measure of my own objectiveness in that process. I've told you before, the hardest thing you'll ever do is try and keep your own prejudice from coloring what you see in the Scriptures. And that is not something you do one or two times. That's something you have to struggle with every time. But that, I got into that because that was David Benedict, and he was of the last generation, the Baptist historian. And those were his direct words. So I don't think we made it to this point in my presentation. But this is from 1 Chronicles chapter 13. I told you we'd look at this story a little bit, not in depth. There's actually another story I want to look at in depth that I'm going to have to get into within about 7 minutes. So, and 1 Corinthians 13. This is where David has come up with the great idea that the ark is languishing. You know, David made Jerusalem Israel's capital. It had not been, it's important to remember, it had not been Israel's capital. That was all David. Remember, he captured it mainly through Joab's bravery and ingenuity, but because it was considered impregnable. But Joab found a way in and opened those gates, and it finally fell to David. David wanted it because if you've never studied what it was back then, or even you can still see a lot of the geographical features that made it desirable. So it was in a good location. It was in a very defensible location. It had its own source of water inside. You couldn't lay siege on them, in other words, and bring them out because they're going to run out of water or anything like that. In fact, Twain, I don't know if you've ever done it. You ever gone down into David's passageway, as they call it down there? That is one of the things I'd really like to do, is see that in person. I've studied it, on film many times, but there is a famous passageway going down and down and down into the rock under Jerusalem, which led to that main water source. If we had more time, I'll let you talk about it, but maybe later you can describe it, another thing. I'd like to hear a first-hand report of that. So in 1 Chronicles 13, David has settled in to Jerusalem. It's well established as the capital at this point. So now he gets to thinking about the Ark of the God left out there, the Ark of the Covenant, and he says, you know what? that thing ought to be in Jerusalem. It ought to be here. It symbolizes the presence, the holy presence of God with His people. And this is the center of our nation now, and it should be here. Then He called a group together. And if you go back and read this story in detail later, one thing I would ask you to do is look at all the details that are given to you about who's in that group. It is broken down for you. But to put it succinctly, every VIP, whether because he's a wealthy individual, whether he's because a religious scholar, regardless, anybody that was an opinion leader. And that's always important when you want to make a change, guys. Know who your opinion leaders are and get them on board. Because that when you want to change something, that's where you have to start. Watch how the denominations do it. They're very good at it. But he brought all of them together, whether they were army officials, whether they were priestly officials, whether they were wealthy individuals, and he put his idea to them. And this is verse 4 there. All the assembly agreed to do so, for the thing was right in the eyes of all the people. I always love the way God words His Scripture to us. Of course, He is very deliberate. That's why I tell you, don't give up any word in the Scripture that is actually in the Scriptures. He words them very specifically just so we will learn the right lessons. And it becomes very obviously, very clearly in that opening to 1 Chronicles that what God wants you to know is that David is acting on his own wisdom, and he has called all of these VIPs of the nation together and putting his idea out there, getting their buy-in, and getting all of them to agree. What's wrong with that process? Not a word about God in any of that. No effort whatsoever. And now think about this. Who are we talking about? I know we're talking about some of the wealthy, some of the army officials, high officials, things like that. But we're also talking about the priests and the scribes and, so, and we're talking about David himself. How's he called? The man after God's own heart. David got a little too comfortable with his knowledge and understanding of the Lord. That's always the most dangerous place you can get. Never get too comfortable with the Almighty God. Never get to thinking you know His way of thinking. I can't tell you how many times through the decades I've been in meetings where different questions are being pursued about will this be right if we do this? Will this be scriptural? And the danger comes when I hear these words. Somebody says, "Well, I'm pretty sure God doesn't care about that." Are you? Are you willing to bet your soul on that? Are you willing to bet the soul of all these people you influence? Are you willing to bet the souls of your children and your grandchildren that without even consulting the Lord, you're pretty sure He doesn't care about that? And by the way, that is one of the things I've heard about the instrument many times through those decades. Someone say, "Well, you think this, I believe this, and everything." The bottom line is I'm pretty sure God doesn't care about whether we use the instrument. Really? Based on what? Based on your own personal, understanding of the Lord. So there's that old thing about forgetting who is God and who is the flawed human. So all the cream of Israel thought this thing was right to do. And so, therefore, they proceeded to do it. And that is the setting for that infamous scene we talked about last week, about where they put it on a cart, they're bringing it out. They had all these VIPs there to honor the Lord. And that was what they said, you know. So it's a big thing that everybody is very excited and fired up about. And they pick the ark up and they put it on a cart and they start moving it. One of the specific things that is said there is that they put it on a brand new cart. Oh, why did they do that? They wanted to show how they were honoring the Lord. Again, what was the problem? The problem was that's not how God said to honor him. That was human wisdom deciding how we would honor him. And so poor old Uzzah, and before you get too worried about Uzzah, please understand, it doesn't tell you anything about his eternal destination. It just tells you the price he had to pay for that act in this world. So that ark starts slipping when it hits a pothole. They didn't have any good roads then either. So it starts to slip, and Uzzah reaches out because it is literally going to fall into mud. Well, now surely it makes more sense to catch the Ark of the Covenant, the representation of the actual presence of God, and keep it from going in the mud. What could possibly be wrong with that? I don't think God would care about that at all. And neither did any of them, including Uzzah. And he paid with his life. God instantly struck him dead. Mike?
Yeah, it just shows, that we had good intentions, but the old phrase, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Absolutely.
And, the thing is that God will always is good on his promises, but he'll always fulfill his promises also. So, and he proved it there, that he will fulfill his promises. If you don't do it according to my way, you're ready to pay the price.
And he's proved it time and time again throughout the Bible. Like I said, he's given us all these great teaching tools, and we make our decisions based on the fact that we're pretty sure God doesn't care about that. Yeah. I'm pretty sure I better consult the mind of God before I decide what he does and does not care about. So you get down to verse 12 there. And this is one of my favorite verses in the whole story as well. It says, and this is still 1 Chronicles 13, and David was afraid of God that day. See, what does that show you? When had he not been afraid of God? And this is that sense of being in awe of who God is, and understanding his power and his majesty and his holiness. But David had gotten pretty comfortable with the Lord. For some reason, I don't even know how I got the tag for it, but 25 years back or so, somehow I got the reputation as being a David scholar, which is a huge joke. But it is true that I love David, and that I have studied the Old Testament more than the average preacher. But because of that, I spoke at some of the lectureships. I did some things, and it was always talk to David. I went up to Tennessee, and they said, talk about David. Over the course of David's history, and there are 66 chapters of the Bible devoted to David and his story. So if you don't think God wanted us to learn an awful lot from that, maybe we should all become David scholars. But most of the time, David does what is right. And there's always, like I said, you've got to learn, especially in the Old Testament, to listen for the differences and the additions and the omissions. Because they're mainly speaking that, and those crowds are trained to listen, and so they know what is the emphasis point. Ed and I were joking last week about banging the pulpit sometimes when you're trying to get the point across, David was pretty good about sticking with the Lord. And that one phrase that occurs over and over again in all those little narratives is, and David went and inquired of the Lord. Sound familiar to anyone? David went and inquired of the Lord. David went and inquired of the Lord. All of those stories where David totally messes up, and there's a handful of them, half a dozen or so. Every one of those stories, the one phrase that you're expecting to be there that is not there, David went and inquired of the Lord. Nowhere in this story, and it's in Kings as well. I like to read it both places because you get a really full picture of the whole series of events, because it happens over a period of time when you do that. But David never inquired of the Lord here. He just inquired of himself, and then he inquired of his priests and of his army VIPs and of the wealthy and the movers and shakers of Israel. And they all thought, verse 4, it's a great idea. So when Uzzah gets killed, David is mad at God. After all, we all know God wouldn't care about something like that. And so David is angry at the Lord, and he is afraid of God that day. And he said, here's the kicker that God doesn't want you to miss. How can I bring the ark of God home to me? When was the appropriate time to ask that question? When he first started thinking about moving the ark to Jerusalem. That had been a good time. And it wasn't that they did not have solid, clear teaching about how God wanted the ark to be moved whenever it was moved. From the blueprints given of making the ark to the actual carrying out of it. Because remember, they moved constantly in the wilderness with it. Pack it up, unpack it up, unpack it, move it to the next place. And you remember the design? It had those rings down the side. I think they were made out of gold or some precious metal anyway. Only Levites could carry it. They could never, ever touch it, though. And see, that's such a huge point to understand. What did the ark represent? The actual presence of God. People that don't have their sins forgiven can't enter the actual presence of God. And God's teaching tool, among hundreds literally that he gave us in this regard, was the ark and the handling of the ark and all the very specific rules. I get so sick of hearing people tell me today, well, God doesn't care how we carry out these things in worship. He doesn't give us rules for that or patterns for that. What? Have you read the Bible? You look anytime his worship is concerned. He's never more meticulous in those commands. And so the ark had all of these rules about its construction, about its display, and only Levites could carry it. They had to carry it by sliding poles through those rings because human beings couldn't touch the presence of God. And then they had to put it on their shoulders. It was only a specific group within the Levites that could do it. And that was their job throughout the wilderness, is moving that thing that way. It was never, by the way, to be put on a cart. Who did put it on a cart? I know this is a test of your Old Testament. The Philistines. Yeah. So when God's glory departs from Israel, and that's the high priest Eli's, one of his sons' name, that is born during this story I'm about to tell you. He is named Ichabod, which means the glory of God has departed Israel. They were going to war with the Philistines like they had done many times. And they went to war, and it wasn't going well. So they said, what is wrong here? And see, again, they forgot that all their past victories had been granted by who? God. They went out to fight against the Philistines in their own wisdom and strength, and they were getting it handed to them, okay? And so they fall back, they regroup, and they say, what? I don't understand. Why are we losing? We always whoop these guys. Well, you used to do it the way God said, and you quit, and He's not blessing you. And so they decide, in one of my favorite stories, they decide in their own wisdom then that the reason they're getting whipped is not that they don't have God with them, but what? That they don't have the Ark of the Covenant with them. Remember, again, God's teaching tool in that regard had been He would command them at times to take the Ark into war with them and to put it where? At the front. Why? To teach them that their only way of victory was through the power and the presence of God.
Didn't put fear of
So, yeah, at different times, yes. So, he goes and he does this, and they say, why are we losing? Oh, we don't have the ark. See, they'd never before made their own decision to take the ark. God would tell them, hey, take the ark, put it at the front. Yeah. So they don't do that. Then they decide, oh, we're going to use, the ark becomes a talisman to them. Instead of God, it's like one of these heathen nations around them, and you've got all these religious objects that you can use to manipulate God to do what you want, see. So they've fallen into that type of thinking. They take the ark with them, and God causes them to be slaughtered. Not just lose, but to be slaughtered. And the Philistines get the ark. And then they have their little adventures. But eventually, they learn. Israel can't learn. The Philistines learn that God doesn't want them to have His ark. Yep. And so they put it on a cart and get rid of it. Send it back to Israel. So you could even think, and I'll leave you with this to percolate on, okay? You could even think if you were David and you were those other officials and VIPs, well, you've seen it moved on a cart before. But they forgot that the people who put it on a cart were those Philistines who did not know anything about. Another key point to remember, how God had instructed the ark to be handled. They put it on a cart and He left them alone. That's good enough for David, except for he's going to go buy a fancy new cart to honor the Lord. All right, we're out of time. Read those stories. They'll help you understand the importance of what we do in worship and why we do it in worship. Class dismissed. I want to say